Well, as part of a 10-day program of celebrating her life, the African National Congress will launch the Winnie Mandela Day of Service in Soweto in recognition of her dedication to the service of ordinary people. It is this, among other activities, that has led to the view that the governing party is perhaps reinventing its narrative around Mama Winnie, certainly at the time of her passing. To discuss this and a number of issues, we're joined now by political analyst Khaya Sithole. Good evening to you, and thank you for doing this. There is this sense that almost every political party is claiming some part of Winnie Mandela in her passing in a way they might not have done when she was alive.
Yeah, I suppose every South African feels that they own a piece of Mama Winnie Mandela. This is why we called her the mother of the nation. But obviously, when it comes to political parties, historically, they would have preferred to sort of neglect her because she represents the greatness of what the ANC used to be. So, of course, you wouldn't want to be a political party that keeps saying that actually, look at how great the ANC was or could have been. So I do think that in this moment, then they've sort of tapped into the national mood, where the national mood sort of transcends any political affiliation, and everyone acknowledges the immense role that she played in simply delivering what we've come to embrace as a modern-day democracy.
But what is it about her life, her story, that has so endured despite very deliberate efforts to discredit her, efforts which went all the way to the British Prime Minister's office in 1992, John Major, then, internationally, the Winnie Mandela that is loved by South Africa now isn't perhaps greeted or remembered as fondly?
So the sense of fortitude and perseverance that she exemplified simply means that for a lot of people, however the transition was managed, they will always remember that this was the one person who was at the face of the struggle for a very long period of time. And last year I sort of wrote about this, which is to say there is something that needs to be appreciated about the fact that unlike individuals who were perhaps in exile or in prison, her confrontation with the brutality of apartheid was something that didn't have the insulation of, for example, a prison cell. So this is a person who would go to sleep at night not knowing who was going to bang down her door in the middle of the night and take her off away to wherever it is that they'd want to take her. So I do think that when we talk about just how brutal and oppressive the apartheid system is, perhaps no single individual was as brutalized as she was. So I do think that a lot of South Africans always remember the fact that perhaps anyone who's been through such trauma and brutality would have to sort of figure out how to react to what the transition delivered. So I do think that her enduring appeal is people simply acknowledging that whatever flaws you might think she has, this is a person who put it all on the line. She was willing to sacrifice everything that she had and everything that she was in order to sort of get us to a better place.
It's one thing, of course, to remember the brutality she faced from the apartheid regime, but the story, in a way, it could be said, didn't necessarily end so well even post-democracy. You've written extensively about deliberate efforts to thwart her rise. She was always seen as a renegade, as somebody who wasn't a disciplined cadre, and there was always nervousness, particularly around the Mandela Rainbow Project and Reconciliation Project, that she wasn't going to toe the line, and so efforts were made to deal with her.
Look, there was a lot of political anxiety about whether she was going to buy in to this idea of a reconciliation project. And of course, the reconciliation project sort of became championed by Nelson Mandela himself. And a lot of people sort of then said, no, this is the way that we're going to go. But of course, for her, she sort of had an idea that actually, in order to sort of ensure that, we deliver what we promised our people when we're engaging in the struggle, we need to be able to say, these are the things that we're willing to concede on, and these are the things that we are going to demand. And she always formed the opinion that perhaps the concession was too much in favor of the minority government at that stage of the 1993 and 1994 talks. So the fact that she was a militant had never been in dispute. But you sort of see that what became the new narrative was to find a way to either suffocate her voice within the ANC. They gave her a very minor ministry, which was the Deputy Minister of Arts and Culture in the first parliament, and even then she didn't last a full term. So you sort of saw it as a way of then saying, how do we actually ensure that in spite of the fact that we are now engaging in this reconciliation project, we do not have a voice this prominent saying, actually, I'm not buying into this, because then that derails the entire project altogether.
And of course, we know that she was fired and then rehired, and then she resigned. And there's been much talk recently around what happened in 1997 at that Mahikeng conference when she could have been nominated for the deputy presidency of the party, and deliberate efforts by Thabo Mbeki, for example, you say, to make sure she was not elected, and instead Jacob Zuma was.
Yeah, so if you really look at how 1997 developed, we had this very strange situation where the TRC actually said that she must come to account. But then the question that some of us have been engaging in is, why was she essentially the only prominent ANC leader who had to come and account in her individual capacity, while for the rest of the party there was a blanket submission, which was to say, look, when we're engaged in the struggle, these are the things that we might have done in order to pursue, you know, this militancy that was necessary in order for us to get somewhere. So you get the impression that there were two submissions. There's the blanket submission, which essentially absolves everyone else, because then no one else has got this lingering thing of saying the TRC found against you. But in her case, she then had to come and present in her own individual capacity. And in part of that presentation, then there were stories that were then put to her. And remember, the TRC is not a court of law. So the TRC is then saying, let us ventilate stories. And of course, if there is no counter to that story, it becomes the prevailing narrative. And this is something that we carried for a 20-year period. And now suddenly people are coming back and saying, well, actually, the way that turned out is not necessarily true. So you saw even recently people who probably fueled that type of propaganda, people who actually did create the environment for us to see in a particular way, are now coming out and saying, but actually there were things that were done in order to create that particular image that all of us have bought into for a 20-year period.
So how might it have stung her that, in a way, her party left her to the wolves in that sense, and yet now we're seeing this reinvention of the narrative where she's hailed as a hero, as though, you know, since 1994, that's how she was treated?
I think it will probably hurt her a lot, because then what you're seeing here is that we don't have a new ANC. We probably have an ANC that's always known the reality of what went on there, and then you're saying, oh, so why are we now saying, oh, by the way, we've been a bit unfair in sort of framing her legacy over the past 2 decades? What was in it for the ANC in particular and for the rest of society in framing her legacy in that particular narrative, and why are we now suddenly abandoning that? Is it because now we know that she'll never be a threat politically or socially? So you have to start asking those questions of saying, what was this Damascus moment that has then even led to people coming up and confessing that they were actually part of a coordinated project to simply discredit her socially, politically? So then she started lacking that legitimacy where everyone said, oh, actually this is not the type of person who should lead a party. So even if you look at the 1997 conference, the way it actually was executed, it was quite brutal and it was very calculated. So I think last week we saw the former president Thabo Mbeki simply saying, oh, she never merited a nomination at the conference, but that's not really how it worked out, because the very first thing that he did was to amend the rules of the conference on the opening day of the conference. So she would have arrived there knowing that 10% from the floor would put your name on the ballot, but then on the very first day we changed those rules, and now suddenly it's 25% that you need to put on the ballot. And as we've seen, even with last year's lead up to the Nazareth conference, you do not arrive there without the numbers. These are the things that you build up over time. You create that momentum so that you would know that when you get there, you will have the numbers. And in her case, of course, she was cruelly denied that opportunity. And for the ANC to then pretend that she simply showed up at the conference without bothering to even caucus and sort of generate that type of momentum is actually a revision of history, which you should not be accepting.
And of course, that true to form, former President Thabo Mbeki reflected on her life in a particular way in recent days. Khaya Sithole, thank you for your analysis, and I suppose putting the brakes on how that story is being reshaped.